I'm a 15-year-old independent and new to the political scene. Even though I'm not allowed to vote, I still have a voice in this election, and I know its outcomes affect me today and as I grow up. Therefore, I will utilize my freedom of speech and voice my opinion. Thanks in advance for listening. As I've watched the presidential debates in the news, it's definitely easy to notice, even at my age, that the biggest problem of our nation is the economy. I've been repeatedly exposed to this topic, addressed multiple times throughout this election. 4 years ago, our nation went through the biggest recession, the biggest economic crisis since the Great Depression. The result was the loss of nearly 15 million jobs, a crash in the housing market, multiple bailouts that cost taxpayers billions, and ultimately the largest growth and the biggest monster the U.S. has to face, the deficit. This deficit has continued to rise and is now more than $16 trillion. A country bound by a rising $16 trillion deficit is not a free country. By the time I graduate in 2015, we are estimated to be chained in $23 trillion. Should I, fresh out of high school and not even into college, have to burden the mistakes of the previous generations? Being enslaved by this debt doesn't sound like a life of liberty and justice to me. Yes, America is a free country, but only if we keep it that way. A Hebrew proverb my dad mentioned to me states, "Owe no man anything but to love one another." So much for love. It's really hard to love one another when you're strangled by $16 trillion in debt. So, I was determined to find out the answers to a few questions. How did this recession come to be, and whose fault is it? How can we prevent it from happening again, and how can we reverse its effects? How can we tame this debt monster and then slay it? President Obama sure has highlighted the fact that it was the previous administration's fault for the state of the economy. However, after doing some research, I think his claim warrants critique. He's also been very vocal about how bad the conditions were when he took office. But even though this recession started just before Obama's presidential term, and even though he campaigned on fixing the economy, I was surprised of his focus in the first 2 years of his administration. His focus was not on creating jobs, nor really improving the economy. On top of it all, he continued to increase the deficit, and by increase, I mean by more than any other president. Obama has consistently put the blame on the Bush administration. By the way, did I mention his party had control of the House and Senate in his first 2 years? But even though he points fingers at Bush, the influences on this recession can be traced all the way back to the 1990s. Yes, traced back to Bill Clinton's administration, well before the Bush years. Don't get me wrong, Bush isn't getting a free pass either. So, the problems trace back to the 1990s, and as noted by a resounding majority, the recession is linked back to that time by one gigantic factor, the housing market. Now, I'm not saying it was only the housing market that caused the economic calamity, but for now, it's the focus of this message. Banking lending practices, high national debt, income inequality, as well as all personal debt are all contributors. However, all of these issues, all of them, can be linked by greed, and greed revolves around American housing. Let's go back to 1993. It all started with the Community Reinvestment Act and the Affordable Housing Mission by the government-sponsored enterprises Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac. The basic goal was to help more Americans get into their own home, more specifically, help low-income people be able to purchase a home. The government seemed to have good intentions, but, like most of the times the government gets involved, it causes more problems than solutions. Thomas Jefferson once said, "Congress has not unlimited powers to provide for the general welfare, but only those specifically enumerated." Seems to me that if Congress allowed government to control us, we Americans might have more. So, to be able to achieve this goal, the lending standards were reduced or deregulated. The strategy was that if more people qualified for a mortgage loan, the more people would buy a home. The effort to reduce standards was published at the request of President Clinton in 1994. By 1995, the discretion used when qualifying loans was dramatically lowered. For banks, simply proving they were looking for qualified buyers didn't cut it. The bank regulators were expected to enforce the new lowered standards and now had to show they had actually made a requisite number of loans to low and moderate income borrowers, or LMI borrowers. Basically, meet a quota of loans sold to LMI people. By 1997, Fannie offered a 97% loan-to-value mortgage. That is only having to pay a 3% down payment, barely giving any risk to home buyers. The only consequence of failing to pay their mortgage would be bad credit for a few years, and only losing a small down payment, that 3%. The reason Fannie Mae could benefit from giving loans with such low down payments was that it would be more likely for people to take a longer time to pay down their loans, especially since they were LMI. And this slowly but enormously increased the interest rates they would have to pay. They were these adjustable rate mortgages, which would rise in just 2 years to a much higher payment. Eventually, to sum it up, lending standards were lowered and lowered until people with no jobs, no income, no assets, and no credit rating were able to get huge mortgages for no money down and no proof of income. This happened over a series of years, from the Clinton administration through the Bush administration. These loans were named subprime and Alt-A loans because they were given to people, again, with no income, no job, or no asset. Many mortgage applications were not even being checked by mortgage writers, and some applicants were even prompted to lie on them. Feel the greed coming in? These loaning businesses had a mindset in believing that home prices would never go down and continue upward. They thought this way because there was an increased demand for buying homes, allowing the worth of homes to rise. More homes were being bought not just because anyone could now qualify for one, but because those who could already buy them for the same price or less, well, now they could get an upgrade or even bigger house. Also, some people would buy numerous homes to sell for later as an investment. Basically, the buying of houses skyrocketed during this time. This was the beginning and starting point of a revelation that changed the game into one of making money more than anything. By 2001, Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac were even offering no down payment at all. Through 2001 to 2007, conventional mortgages, the traditional mortgages with the 30-year fixed rate, dropped from 57.1% to 33.1%. Basically, the safe loan practices were reducing drastically. At the same time, subprime loans, those with bad credit, very risky, rose from 7.2 to 18.8%, and Alt-A loans went from 2.5 to 13.9%. Also, through this same span of 6 years, the residential mortgage debt rose from less than 50% to nearly 75%, and the 97% loan-to-value mortgages became more popular as they rose from 10% to 40%. What does this mean? Banks were selling more loans to low moderate income folks than they were to people with the ability to pay them back. Now, 38% of all those purchases during this time were to come from undeserved areas, usually inner cities, and 25% were to be loans to low income and very low income borrowers. You could say the quota was made above and beyond, but this contributed to the fact that some people were defaulting on their very first payment. Another fact was that, as mentioned before, people had very little to lose if they defaulted on their mortgage payment. Blind to that fact, though, this started turning into something not about getting people homes, it became about business, also known as greed. The newest and biggest market had just been discovered. Now, I'm all about helping the needy and especially the poor, but when the government starts overreaching and creating programs that do more harm than good, it creates devastating consequences. Ben Franklin once stated, "The more public provisions were made for the poor, the less they provided for themselves, and of course became poorer." Getting everyone in affordable housing without working for it is a huge mistake. I recall another Hebrew proverb, "If a man doesn't work, neither shall he eat." Continuing with the housing, the banks started noticing this booming business, and they wanted to be a part of it. Greed. After observing models showing how much this business really had boomed, banks securitized mortgages and turned them into mortgage-backed securities that people could invest in. The banks were completely ignoring all data showing a rising number of defaulting payments. This means that the banks bought many mortgages and combined them together, even if it meant they would not know the credit risks or worthiness of them. Then they divided that big mortgage pool that holds all kinds of mortgages into pieces called tranches, and then sold those tranches to investors. The whole of this was called a collateralized debt obligation, CDO. It worked like this. Those who owned the tranches would get paid when each person in that certain tranche paid their mortgage, and did not get paid when the mortgages were not paid. Confused? Well, there was this huge increase in the housing market, and banks were making more money by taking all the mortgage loans, combining them all together, then dividing them up into smaller pieces, and selling them to investors. Problem was that the investors had no idea that mortgages were being defaulted on, and the banks had turned a blind eye. Check this out, that wasn't enough. To top it all off, there was such a huge demand for these CDOs that there were not enough mortgages to go around to investors. So, the banks invented synthetic CDOs. They made fake ones, pretty sneaky, eh? But this became a bet or economic gamble as whether or not people would pay their mortgages. The arising problem was the defaults and foreclosures that started, and the banks were not even paying attention to this. They were having a ball with all their CDO sales. By this time, the Bush administration, I told you he wouldn't get off free, was touting home ownership at an all-time high. The banks were making huge money, and many people that had little investment or low down payments into homes were going to start missing those first month's payments. By 2007, an uneasy feeling started to settle in. Greed from the banks and greed from politicians and greed from Wall Street were in full view. However, the biggest and most untalked about greed came from the individuals applying for the loans in the first place, the American people. It's easy to place blame on the politicians we elect, but sometimes we need to point the finger at ourselves. There's nothing wrong with wanting the American dream. I've learned throughout my short life that with hard work, persistence, determination, and faith, you'll reap what you sow and live a good life. But even at 15, I know that if I can't afford to pay for something, I shouldn't be asking for handouts or for someone to hand me a risky loan. I also know that if I don't have to put anything down or invest any hard work into something, then I really have no incentive to honor my obligation of a deal if it starts going bad. At some point, we can't be a victim. We as Americans have to take responsibility for our own actions as well as our own decisions. It's common sense. Beginning around 2006, it was noticeable that home prices began falling. Another huge trend began, just as big as the last one, but this time it was for the worst, and would be the cause of this great economic crisis. In 2006, over 1.2 million homes in America were foreclosed upon, and in 2007, 2.2 million homes were foreclosed. In October 2007, the U.S. Secretary of the Treasury called the bursting housing bubble the most significant risk to our economy. Well, for some reason, no one was seriously paying attention to this and neglected it. By the way, people want to blame Bush policies, but it was his U.S. Secretary that sounded the alarm. And it's important to note that the House of Representatives was led by Nancy Pelosi, Democrat, and Senate was led by Sen. Harry Reid, also a Democrat. The Democrats controlled both houses a full year leading up to the financial collapse, and although they were warned by a Bush official, there was no action to stop the rising economic disaster. By the way, President Barack Obama was a senator during that time. By 2008, home prices were rapidly falling past anything ever imaginable. This was because of these increased foreclosure rates. In 2008, the foreclosure rates zipped past 3 million, a 225% increase since 2006. Because of this, the bank CDOs dropped dramatically in value. But the aftershock of this economic boom was just beginning. Banks began running out of money as people started to pull out their savings. The banks began to breathe their last breath. All they had were the possession of unfinished homes and the authority to give some really bad FICO scores. Great. There was not enough money to keep the banks running, let alone lend to anyone. Now, many companies use loans to finance their businesses. You know, like first invest and then get a profit kind of a deal. You know, it takes money to make money. These loans might only take 30 days to pay, but for some businesses, these loans were essential for them to be able to pay for their inventories as well as their payrolls. Being accustomed to this strategy, most companies didn't have any way to pay for things, especially when the banks held on for dear life and gripped what money they had remaining, and, of course, reduced the lending. These companies were forced to resort to laying people off to prevent their own business from sinking, just as the banks were. This domino effect continued. Because they were laid off and couldn't afford it, more people started defaulting on their homes, and this in turn caused a landslide of downward home prices. They couldn't afford basic necessities, let alone a house. Because the consumer wasn't buying, companies were now not making enough income, and even more people had to be laid off. As a result, 8 million jobs were lost in 2008. So, 2009. Now, I don't know if the presidential campaign was a distraction or what, but I'm wondering why Obama didn't realize what was happening. There was a stimulus bill that was passed that plugged the hole, but then that was it. And it wasn't even plugged that well. Hey, here you go, greedy banks. Here's some money to hold you over. I mean, the banks had been so responsible with what they had before, right? But after witnessing this devastation and loss of jobs, why didn't he continue focusing on creating the jobs that were lost? And why instead, if the economy was in such shambles, and he had all the power of Democratic Congress, did he not take action to fix it? No, he had different priorities, and those being of a very partisan nature. It was the Democrats' opportunity to pass healthcare reform. Really, it was more like healthcare deform. And healthcare, they did. The focus was not the economy, and certainly not jobs during those first 2 years. It became an ideological party free-for-all. You would think running for president, your eyes would be open to this kind of stuff, why you're running for president in the first place, maybe because you want change in America and value the reformation of it. You want to help people. You want to help the 8 million struggling people who had just lost their jobs. Hey, maybe that's the reason they couldn't pay for health care. Well, we'll discuss that another time. Anyways, in January 2009 alone, 740,000 more jobs were lost and the number continued upward. I believe this would have been the perfect opportunity for Obama to create change where it was needed and show leadership. But we stayed in the recession and people are still suffering, and here we are, 4 years later. The unemployment rate did not decrease, and now our own country is going bankrupt. Our government, just like the low and moderate income people who bought homes, is spending money on things we can't afford. Obamacare. Our rising $16 trillion debt proves it. This debt is the outcome of a recession going back to the actions well before the Bush years. It roots back to the time of an administration before I was even born. And now, our issues are resulting from the irresponsible spending habits of our commander-in-chief. Every month, my dad balances his checkbook. But in 4 years, our government can't even balance theirs once. But unlike the government, my dad doesn't get bailed out when times are tough. He just works more hours or does more with less. But for our issues with the national debt, this time, we won't have anyone to bail us out. So, what happens to the people dependent on the government and all else of America after that? I don't have the answer to that just yet. But I know it won't be good. Our country, we're enslaved to our debt. Are we really free? I read where our forefathers, being simple merchants and farmers, went up against the world's greatest and biggest military of the era. They wanted freedom. They wanted liberty. They wanted independence and freedom to make choices. They didn't want to have the government making decisions for them. And when they had a choice, they chose to fight. They chose to go against the status quo. And even when all odds were against them, their spirit of excellence and ability to sacrifice was bigger than the Goliath in front of them. So, now we have our choice. We have our Goliath. Do we continue to choose greed? Do we continue to allow others or the government to dictate our lives? When will we have our forefathers' determination? Look, we honestly can't blame any definite one person or administration or political party for this financial crisis, but we can conclude that in the past 3 administrations, greed has played a role. Government involvement, bank lending practices, bank profits, mortgage companies are all part of the problem. However, again, the biggest culprit is us. It's the average American. And now, in the next few days, we have a choice to make. This choice includes the same choice our forefathers had to make, and that our idea of democracy is on the line. Although it doesn't include the physical turmoil they endured, it now, more than ever, includes the battle of our hearts. It is a choice of stepping up to our responsibilities. It's a choice that includes standing up to our national debt. It's a choice to getting independence back to not just the middle class, but to all Americans. If we can get the government out of the way and let more Americans create more jobs, yes, Americans, then we can raise all boats. We can get more people off welfare and then into the middle class instead of the opposite. This election, it's about choosing a president that will stand up to this national debt and take it seriously. It's about choosing fiscal responsibility and independence instead of government dependence. It's about electing a president who doesn't point fingers and blame others for our current problems. It's about electing a president that cares more about spending time at solving the nation's problems than meeting with Hollywood elites. This is one of the defining moments of our country. It's the battle of our time. It's a time to test our morals and our convictions. America, it's time for a change. We can't continue on the current path we're on. What say you, America? I'm Victoria Tolley, and I approve this message.